The moment Aaron Maddox rode into Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1882, every soul in town felt the silence arrive before the man himself did. He came in from the eastern mesa just as the sun dropped behind the Sandia Mountains. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Cutter, moving with the slow, unhurried rhythm of a creature that had never once been pushed past its own comfort. Aaron sat in the saddle the way only a man who had grown up there could, not stiff, not performative, just present, the reins loose in his left hand, his right resting easy on his thigh. He wore a duster the color of dry creek clay, a hat that had seen too many seasons to hold its original shape, and boots that told the story of 10,000 miles without once complaining about it. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulder, lean everywhere else, with dark hair that curled just slightly at the nape of his neck and gray eyes that people described later, when they tried to describe him at all, as eyes that listened more than they looked. He did not call out a greeting to anyone on the main street of Harlan Creek. He did not tip his hat or introduce himself to the man sweeping the boardwalk outside the general store. He rode Cutter to the livery at the end of the street, arranged stabling with 2 words and 3 coins, slung his saddlebag over his shoulder, and walked to the only hotel in town, which was operated out of the back portion of the saloon and distinguished from it only by a hand-painted sign that said rooms above the door on the side alley. He took a room. He did not talk at dinner. He was not rude about it. He was simply quiet in a way that was so complete, so without apology, that the other men at the long table in the back of the saloon eventually stopped waiting for him to say something and just let him be. That was always how it went with Aaron Maddox. People eventually stopped waiting. He had come to Harlan Creek because he had heard from a cattle broker in Santa Fe that old Hector Dunleavy was looking for a reliable hand to manage the eastern range of the Dunleavy Spread, a 4,000-acre cattle operation that ran up toward the canyon country and required somebody who could work long stretches alone without losing his mind to loneliness. Aaron Maddox was precisely that kind of man. He had worked ranges from Colorado down through West Texas, and every employer had said the same thing about him. Best hand they ever had, quiet as a stone, and when he spoke, you listened because it was worth your while. He went to see Hector Dunleavy the next morning. Hector was 60 years old and moving like a man who was running out of road. His hands were gnarled from decades of roping and branding, and he had a cough that had taken up permanent residence in his chest sometime around Christmas and showed no interest in leaving. He sat in a cane chair on the porch of the main house and looked Aaron over with the unhurried appraisal of a man who had hired enough cowboys to know the difference between the real article and the performance of one. "You worked cattle in the canyon country before?" Hector asked. "3 seasons," Aaron said. 2 near Taos, 1 down south of here along the Rio Puico drainage. Hector nodded. "You know what I need out there? Somebody who can read the land, keep the strays from pushing through the canyon breaks, rotate the grazing before it gets eaten down to nothing, and come back at the end of each week with an honest count." Hector looked at him another moment. "That's exactly right," he said. "Most men I talk to tell me they can do it. You just told me what it actually is." "Can I do it?" Aaron asked. "You're hired," Hector said. That was the extent of their negotiation. Aaron Maddox moved his few belongings into the bunkhouse at the south end of the Dunleavy ranch yard, learned the layout of the eastern range in 2 days, and by the 3rd morning was already out on the mesa with the cattle, doing precisely what he had described, and doing it well. It was on his 4th day on the Dunleavy ranch that he first encountered Jane Covington. He had come back to the main yard mid-morning to pick up additional fence staples and wire that Hector's foreman, a stocky man named Reese Calhoun, had promised would be waiting at the barn. Aaron was leading Cutter through the yard when he heard a voice coming from the direction of the kitchen garden, a voice that was not angry exactly, but had the very particular quality of a person who had made up their mind and was now explaining that decision to someone who disagreed. "I understand what you are suggesting," the voice said, "and I appreciate the thought behind it, but I am not going to plant the corn closer to the fence just because it is easier to water that way. The soil near the fence does not drain properly after rain, and we will lose half of it to root rot before July. I would rather carry water 20 extra feet and keep the plants alive. Thank you." Aaron paused, despite himself, because the voice was so calm and so certain, and because whoever was speaking sounded like they had already done the thinking that most people around here would not bother to do. He rounded the corner of the barn and saw her. Jane Covington was 24 years old, and she had the look of a woman who had spent her whole life outdoors, not roughened by it, but shaped by it, in the way that good leather is shaped by use into something better than it started as. She was not tall, but she carried herself as though she had settled the question of her own presence in the world long ago and found no reason to revisit it. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up with what appeared to be slightly more efficiency than ceremony. Her eyes were the color of old amber, warm and direct, and she had a dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose that the New Mexico sun was apparently determined to deepen no matter what she did about it. She was standing in the kitchen garden with a hand trowel, facing a girl of about 12 who was clearly a younger version of her same coloring, same set to the jaw, who was in the process of reconsidering her gardening advice. The girl's name, Aaron would later learn, was Clara, Jane's younger sister, who had come west with Jane and their mother 2 years prior after their father had passed in Missouri. Jane looked up when she heard Cutter's footfall in the yard, and she found Aaron standing at the corner of the barn, not exactly staring but not exactly not staring either. He had just stopped walking, which was unlike him. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. Not unfriendly, just direct. "Fence wire," he said. "Reese said it'd be at the barn." "It is. Far end, stacked on the left side of the door." She returned her attention to the garden, giving him the information and not making a production of giving it. Aaron went and found the wire exactly where she said it would be. He loaded it onto Cutter's pack rigging without rushing and without dawdling, and he was almost out of the yard again when he stopped, because he could still hear her talking to Clara, explaining about soil composition and water drainage in terms that were patient and specific and showed a mind that paid genuine attention to things. He did not say anything else to her that day. He rode back out to the eastern range with the fence wire and spent the afternoon repairing breaks in the line and thinking about the way she had told him where the wire was without making him feel like he had been helped, which was a rarer quality than most people appreciated. Jane Covington was, as Aaron would piece together over the following days, the daughter of the late Thomas Covington, who had been a farmer and schoolteacher in Boonville, Missouri, before a fever took him in the winter of 1880. After his passing, Jane's mother, Margaret Covington, a practical woman in her early 50s who had the same direct amber eyes as her daughter, had made the decision to accept a position as housekeeper for Hector Dunleavy, who was a distant cousin on her mother's side, and had written offering work and room and board in exchange for someone to manage his household, which had been running without feminine order since his own wife had passed 4 years earlier. So Margaret managed the house, Clara helped with whatever needed helping, and Jane ran the kitchen garden, helped with the accounts when Hector's eyesight failed him in the evenings, taught Clara her lessons in the afternoon, and generally occupied herself with the kind of relentless, useful industry that meant there was never a moment in the day when she was not doing something that mattered. She was, in other words, a woman who filled silence with purpose rather than with noise, and that was a quality Aaron Maddox recognized, because it was his own. He saw her again 2 days later when he came in for the end-of-week accounting that Hector required. He came into the main house and found Jane at the kitchen table with the ledger books open and a pen in her hand, writing figures in a clear, even hand while Hector sat across from her and dictated. Aaron waited in the doorway, hat in hand, and Jane looked up and held up one finger without breaking Hector's sentence. indicating that she had registered his presence and would be with him momentarily, and Aaron found that so perfectly reasonable that he simply waited. When she had finished the column and blotted the pen, she said to Hector, "Your new man is here with the Count." Hector waved Aaron in, and Aaron reported the numbers: head of cattle, condition of the grass on the eastern mesa, status of the water sources at the 2 rock tanks he had found near the canyon wall, and Hector listened and asked 2 questions and was satisfied. It was Jane who wrote the numbers down as Aaron spoke them, her pen moving quickly, and when he finished she read the numbers back to him to confirm them without being asked, because that was simply the correct thing to do when you were recording someone else's words. "That's right," Aaron said. "Good," she said, and closed the ledger. "You keep the books for the whole operation?" he asked. He had not meant to ask it. It came out because he was genuinely curious. She looked at him with a slight tilting of her head that suggested she was deciding how much to read into the question. "Mr. Dunleavy's eyes give him trouble in the evenings," she said, "and I was always better at figures than most. It seemed a useful thing to do." "It is," Aaron said. "Most operations this size have a mess of errors in the tallying by June, usually because whoever is keeping the books isn't thinking beyond the column they're working on." She looked at him with an expression that had shifted slightly, something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "You have done bookkeeping." "Some. Enough to know what bad bookkeeping costs." "Then you'll appreciate," she said, "that I carry a secondary ledger to cross-reference the main one." "That is the right way to do it," he said. And that was the end of that conversation, because there was nothing left to add that was necessary, and neither of them was inclined to say things that were not necessary. He thought about it later, standing by the corral fence as the sun went down, and turned the western sky the particular shade of deep orange that the territory did so well in late spring. He thought about how the conversation had felt, which was like a conversation between 2 people who were speaking the same language, not just in the literal sense but in some deeper sense, where the spaces between the words were not uncomfortable but were simply spaces, and nobody felt obliged to fill them with something meaningless. He had not had a conversation that felt like that in a long time. He was not entirely sure he had ever had one. The weeks of May unfolded over the Dunleavy Ranch with the slow golden richness of a New Mexico spring, and Aaron fell into the rhythm of the eastern range with the ease of a man who had been born to exactly this kind of work. He was out before sunrise most mornings, riding the mesa with Cutter in the early light, watching the cattle and the grass and the sky with the particular quality of attention that made him so good at what he did. An attention that was not anxious, not restless, just present and thorough, like water finding its way into every crack and corner of the ground it traveled over. He came back to the ranch yard twice a week for supplies or reports, and each time he came back he found some occasion to be in the same space as Jane Covington, not by engineering it, but because the ranch yard was not large and she was always somewhere in it doing something useful, and they simply occupied the same world without making a performance of avoiding each other or seeking each other out. They talked when they talked about practical things. She asked him once about the condition of a particular section of fence line that lay near the vegetable plot's water supply ditch, because she was concerned about erosion. He told her what he had seen and what he thought should be done about it. She thanked him without making it elaborate. On another occasion he found her trying to reset a fence post that had worked loose from the ground near the garden, and without being asked he dismounted, set down what he was carrying, and helped her reset it properly, tamping the dirt with the back of a shovel while she held the post plumb. They did not talk during that task, because the task did not require talking. When it was done she said, "Thank you, Mr. Maddox," and he said, "Yes, ma'am," and they went back to what they were doing. But there were moments, and he was aware of them in a way that was unusual for him, because Aaron Maddox was generally not a man who spent time being aware of moments, when he caught himself noticing something about her that had nothing to do with practicality. The way she laughed at something Clara said, which was not a polite or social laugh but a real one, sudden and clear, like water over flat rock. The way she read, she always had a book somewhere about her person, tucked in an apron pocket or set open on whatever flat surface was nearby, and she could move between the book and the task in front of her with a fluidity that suggested both things were equally real to her. The way she stood at the edge of the garden in the early evening, looking out at the mesa, perfectly still for 3 or 4 minutes at a time, just watching the light change, not doing anything else. He recognized that stillness. He lived in it himself, and seeing it in another person felt, in a way he could not have articulated but felt clearly, like unexpectedly recognizing your own reflection in water you had not known was there. It was Clara who forced the first real conversation between them. It was the first week of June, a Tuesday, and Aaron had ridden in for supplies and was at the water trough letting Cutter drink when Clara came running around the corner of the barn with a piece of paper clutched in her hand and nearly collided with him. "Mr. Maddox," she said, breathless, "can you help me? Jane says I have to solve this arithmetic problem before I can go watch the horses being shod, and I have been looking at it for 20 minutes and it makes no sense." Aaron looked at the paper. It was a word problem about apportioning acreage between grazing and hay production, the kind of thing that was actually a practical ranching question dressed up as schoolwork. He read it twice. "What part is giving you trouble?" he asked. Clara pointed at a section in the middle. He talked her through it, step by step, not solving it for her but asking her questions that led her to solve it herself, and Clara's expression moved from frustrated to concentrated to lit up with comprehension, and she wrote the answer in. "Go show your sister," he said. Clara ran off. Aaron was checking Cutter's near front shoe, which he had thought felt slightly loose that morning, when he heard footsteps behind him and looked up to find Jane standing a few feet away, watching him with an expression he could not fully decode. "She told me you helped her," Jane said. "She solved it herself," he said. "I just asked her the right questions." Jane was quiet for a moment. "That is how my father used to teach," she said. "He never gave the answer. He always said that an answer given is forgotten, but an answer earned is owned." Aaron considered that. "Your father was a teacher." "He was, a good one." A pause. "He would have liked the way you just did that." He looked at her and she was not being performatively gracious. She was just saying a true thing, the way she said everything, without ornamentation. "Sounds like he was a good man," Aaron said. "He was the best man I knew," she said, and there was no grief in it that was dramatic, just the plain, settled weight of a truth she had learned to carry. "I suppose that is what sets the standard, is it not? The good men you meet early." Aaron did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, but he held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she held his, and then Cutter shifted and broke the moment, and they both stepped back to the practical world without comment. He rode back out to the eastern range that afternoon with a feeling sitting in his chest that he could not name, and was not sure he wanted to. He had been careful, his whole adult life, about certain things. He had watched other men on other ranges get tangled up in wanting things: companionship, a home, permanence, and he had observed that the wanting often hurt them more than the having helped them. He was not a man who declared himself easily. He was not sure he knew how. But he thought about Thomas Covington that evening, sitting by a small fire on the mesa with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and the stars coming out over the canyon rim, enormous and thick in the black sky. He thought about a man whose daughter remembered him by saying he was the best man she knew. He thought about what it would mean to be remembered that way by someone who saw clearly enough to mean it. He did not come to any conclusions. He was not a man who rushed conclusions. He just sat with it and let the stars do what they did and drank his cold coffee. June moved forward in its own unhurried way, and the Dunleavy Ranch settled into the routines of a working cattle operation in high summer. The grass on the eastern mesa was coming in well, better than Aaron had initially estimated, and he found himself genuinely pleased by this in the quiet, physical way that men who work the land feel: pleasure, not abstracted, not sentimental, but rooted in the actual condition of the actual grass under actual boots. He had his first real trouble in the second week of June. 3 of Hector Dunleavy's cattle had been turned up missing on the eastern mesa, not wandered. Aaron was sure of that, because he knew the land well enough by then to know where wandering cattle went, and these animals were not there. He followed tracks in the red clay soil of the canyon approach and found where they had been driven, single file, through a narrow cut in the rock that he had not previously identified as accessible to cattle. The tracks on the other side disappeared onto hardpan where they could not be followed. He came back to the ranch and reported it to Hector and Reese Calhoun in the same plain terms he would have used to report the weather. "Rustlers working through the canyon?" Reese asked, his jaw tight. "That's what the sign says," Aaron replied. "The cut is narrow enough that you need to know it's there. This was somebody who knew the country." Hector's expression darkened. He had heard about cattle going missing from other operations east of here, the Reamer spread, the old Vasquez Grant lands, and he had hoped his eastern range was remote enough to avoid the attention of whoever was doing it. Apparently not. "What do you think we should do?" Hector asked, looking at Aaron. "Post the canyon access points," Aaron said. "There are 3 other cuts that could work for moving animals through. I can wire across 2 of them and keep watch on the 3rd. If they try it again, I'll know." Reese nodded slowly. "That would keep you out there the better part of 2 more weeks straight." "I know it," Aaron said. "I do not mind it." Which was the honest truth, and everyone in the room knew it. He spent the rest of June on the eastern range, keeping his watch over the canyon cuts, and he caught the rustlers, 3 men from the direction of the Rio Grande drainage, drifters working a small and opportunistic operation on the 23rd of June. He did not handle it dramatically. He rode to find them when he spotted their sign in the early morning, came up on them on the canyon rim before they could move the animals they had penned in a side draw, and told them in a flat, clear voice that they had 20 minutes to move themselves out of the territory before he went back to the ranch and fetched the county sheriff from Bernalillo. They chose to believe him and they left. He went back and retrieved the cattle, all 3. When he brought them in and told Hector what had happened, Hector shook his head and said, "You didn't think to hold them for the law." "They weren't armed," Aaron said. "And holding 3 men alone on the mesa for the half-day ride to Bernalillo and back is how you get yourself shot for somebody else's beef. The cattle are back. It won't happen again." Hector thought about it and nodded. "Can't argue with the result," he said. Jane was standing in the doorway of the kitchen when Aaron came out of Hector's study, and he had the sense from the way she held herself that she had heard at least a portion of the conversation, because she had that particular quality of stillness that meant she was thinking about something that mattered. "You are all right?" she asked. He paused because she had asked it directly and without preamble, not as social nicety but as actual inquiry, looking at him the way she looked at things she wanted to understand. "I am fine," he said. "No trouble beyond the cattle." "Good," she said, and then before he could move on, "I worried when you were out there longer than usual. I know that is not my business to say." Aaron stood with that for a moment. He was not accustomed to people saying things like that to him. Not because it had never happened, but because when it happened, it usually felt like something was being asked of him, some reciprocity of feeling or acknowledgement that he was not sure he knew how to give. But the way Jane said it had no hook in it. She said it the same way she said everything because it was true, and because she saw no reason to pretend it was not, and she was not making a claim on him with it. She was just telling him the truth. "I did not mean to give you cause to worry," he said. "You did not," she said. "I did that myself. You were just doing your work." And she went back to the kitchen, leaving him standing in the hallway with a warmth in his chest that had no name but was growing. The 4th of July in Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory in 1882 was not a large affair by the standards of the eastern cities, but it was enthusiastic, which was a fair substitute. The town gathered in the main street in the evening. There were firecrackers from the general store set off by the more adventurous members of the community, and someone had brought a fiddle, and a banjo out to the flat spot beside the farrier's shop where dancing occurred. Hector Dunleavy brought his household in for the occasion, which meant Margaret Covington arrived in her good dress with Clara beside her in something that had been recently let down at the hem to accommodate a growth spurt. Jane came in a dress the color of sage, simply made but well-fitted, and she had done something different with her hair. It was still pinned up but with more care than she usually took, and there were small curls at her temples that Aaron, when he saw her in the evening light, found it difficult to look away from. Aaron Maddox was not a man who attended social occasions with any enthusiasm, but he had come into town because Reese had asked him to ride in with the wagon and help with the unloading, and he was not the sort of man who refused a reasonable request. He stood at the edge of the gathering with a glass of cider from the general store's supply, watching the fiddle player set up with the expression of a man who found observation perfectly adequate entertainment. Clara found him within 10 minutes, because Clara Covington was not a person who stood at the edges of things. "Mr. Maddox," she said, appearing at his elbow, "do you dance?" "I do not," he said, which was not strictly true but was true enough for practical purposes. "Jane says she does not either, but she is lying," Clara said cheerfully. "She danced all the time in Missouri. She just says she does not because she does not want to be pestered about it." Aaron looked across the gathering to where Jane was standing near her mother, talking to an older woman he did not recognize, holding her cider glass with both hands and watching the fiddle player with a look of unmistakable pleasure. "That is between your sister and herself," he said. Clara considered this. "You like her," she said, with the serene directness of a 12-year-old who has not yet learned to dress observations in social clothing. Aaron looked at her. "Your sister is a fine woman," he said, in a tone that was both true and carefully noncommittal. Clara grinned. She disappeared back into the crowd. Aaron finished his cider and spent a few minutes watching the first dancers take to the flat dirt beside the farrier's shop, and then he moved slowly around the perimeter of the gathering, because standing still for long periods in crowds was not something he did naturally, and found himself arriving near the spot where Jane was standing. She looked at him when he appeared at her side, and there was something in her expression that was warmer than it had been, not nervous. Jane Covington was never nervous in any visible way, but something like pleased. "Clara talked to you," she said. It was not a question. "She did," he said. "She is enthusiastic about other people's lives." "I noticed that," he said. "She will be someone worth knowing when she is grown." Jane smiled at that, real and quiet. "She already is," she said. They stood side by side and watched the dancers, and they did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary, and it was comfortable in the exact way that silence between people who understand each other is comfortable, which is the best kind of comfortable there is. After a while, the fiddle player launched into something slower and sweeter, and couples drifted toward each other on the flat ground. And Aaron, moving only from the certainty of the moment and not from any plan he had made, turned to Jane and offered her his hand. She looked at it, and then at him with those amber eyes that were thinking something he could not read. "I thought you did not dance," she said. "I do not usually," he said. She looked at his hand another moment. Then she took it. She was not a small woman, but she was light on her feet in the way that people who are comfortable in their bodies are light, and she followed his lead without making a production of it, and Aaron found that he remembered more about dancing than he had thought he did. They danced one song without speaking, and then the fiddle moved into something faster, and they stepped apart naturally, and Aaron felt a loss at the separation that was so clear it surprised him. She was breathing slightly faster when the song ended, and there was color in her cheeks, and she looked at him with an expression that was entirely new, unguarded, a little wondering, the expression of someone who has been surprised by their own feeling. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said, and he meant it with everything he had. They walked back together through the gathering toward where Margaret and Clara were, and somewhere in those 20 steps Jane's arm brushed against his, and she did not move away from it, and he did not move away from it. and they arrived at Margaret's side slightly closer together than they had departed. Margaret Covington looked at them both with the contained, knowing expression of a woman who had raised one daughter to adulthood and understood exactly what she was looking at. The weeks of July burned down over the territory with the particular ferocity of a New Mexico summer, and the eastern range became demanding work in the heat, moving cattle to the better shade in the canyon-side canyons, managing water at the rock tanks, keeping the animals from dropping weight they could not afford to lose. Aaron worked through it with the steadiness that characterized everything he did, and he came back to the ranch yard twice a week, the same as always. But things had shifted between him and Jane in some way that was still subtle, but was no longer something he could pretend was not there. She came out to meet him sometimes when she saw him ride in, which she had not done before. She saved him coffee from the morning pot when she knew he was coming in mid-morning. He, in turn, found himself noticing when she was struggling with something, a gate latch that had swollen in the heat and would not close properly, a sack of grain that needed moving, and helping without being asked, which was not something he had done for the other hands because he was not a man who inserted himself, but he did it for her because it seemed simply natural. They talked more now. Not at great length, neither of them was built for conversation that went past what it needed to be, but with increasing ease, and about things that were not only practical. He told her once, sitting on the porch steps of the main house in the evening after she had brought out 2 cups of cool water from the clay pot she kept in the kitchen, about the Colorado high country, about what it looked like in September when the aspen turned gold all at once along the mountain valleys, because she had mentioned she had never been farther west than eastern New Mexico, and he thought she would want to know about it. She listened to him describe it without interrupting, with her chin slightly raised and her eyes somewhere between him and the distance, the way she listened to things she was genuinely imagining rather than just hearing. "It sounds like the world proving it is bigger than you expected," she said when he had finished. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She told him about Missouri, not as a place she missed exactly, but as a place that had shaped her, the wide river and the flat farmland and the particular quality of the summer storms rolling in from the west, the way her father had stood on the porch watching those storms and pointing out the difference between the clouds that meant rain you wanted and the clouds that meant trouble. She was animated when she talked about him, not in a grief-stricken way, but in the way people are animated when they describe someone who gave them something fundamental, and Aaron listened to every word. "He taught you to read the sky," Aaron said. "He taught me to pay attention," she corrected, gently but precisely. "The sky is just one of many things worth paying attention to." Aaron looked at her in the evening light, this woman who paid attention to everything around her in the same deep, unhurried way he paid attention to the land, and he thought that he had never in his life encountered someone who felt so much like a correspondence, not an echo, not a mirror, but a letter answered. He did not say any of this. He was not built for saying things like that, and he knew it, and she seemed to know it too, and she did not seem to require it. It was Reese Calhoun who first said out loud what everyone on the ranch had been thinking since at least the 4th of July. It was a Thursday morning in late July, and Reese and Aaron were repairing a section of working corral fence near the barn, and Reese handed Aaron a board and then leaned against the fence post with his arms folded and said, in the manner of a man who has been holding something in for a while, "You ought to tell her." Aaron squared the board in his hands and drove a nail. "Tell who what?" "You know who," Reese said. "And what?" Aaron drove another nail. "Is it that obvious?" Reese said, with the patience of a man of 45 talking to a younger one. "The horses have figured it out." Aaron set down the hammer and looked at Reese with an expression that was somewhere between resignation and reluctant honesty. "I do not know how to tell her something like that," he said. "Sure you do," Reese said. "You just say it. It is not that simple." "It is exactly that simple," Reese said. "It is just not that easy. Those are different things." Aaron picked up the hammer again. He thought about that for the rest of the morning while they worked, And he thought about it in the afternoon while he was back on the eastern range. And he thought about it into the evening while the light slid off the canyon rim and the cattle settled into their nighttime quiet and Cutter grazed at the end of a long tether. And the stars appeared one by one the way they always did, patient as mathematics. He thought about Reese's distinction between simple and easy. He understood the distinction. He lived in the space between those two things in almost every aspect of his life. Most things worth doing were simple and not easy. Keeping the cattle on the right grass was simple. Setting a fence post properly was simple. Watching the sky for weather was simple. None of them were necessarily easy, but they were all worth doing because they were what the land and the animals and the season required. Maybe this was what the moment required. He rode back to the ranch 2 days early, on a Saturday afternoon in the first week of August, which was unusual enough that Reese raised his eyebrows when Aaron came into the yard. "Everything all right on the mesa?" Reese asked. "Everything is fine," Aaron said. "I just need to speak to Miss Covington." Reese said nothing further, which was charitable of him. Aaron found Jane in the kitchen garden, as he had found her the very first day. Though this time she was not arguing with anyone, she was alone, moving along the rows of beans with a careful eye, checking for the kind of damage that beetles did in August heat. She heard him coming and turned, and her expression shifted in that way it did now when she saw him, warm and open, which still stopped him a little every time. "You are back early," she said. "I am," he said. He stopped at the edge of the garden, holding his hat in both hands, and looked at her. She waited. She was good at waiting. She never hurried people. She just stood there in the afternoon sun with the beans behind her and looked at him with those amber eyes and gave him the space to be however long he needed to be. "Jane," he said, because he had started using her first name somewhere in July, and neither of them had remarked on it. "I am not a man who finds it easy to say things that are not practical. I have spent my whole life being useful to people in the ways that involve work and observation, and the kind of sense that applies to the land. And I have not spent much time being useful to people in the ways that involve saying what I feel, because I was not sure I had a great deal to say in that direction, or that it would be welcome." She had not moved. She was watching him the way she watched the mesa at sunset, with complete attention. "But Reese Calhoun told me this week that there is a difference between something being simple and something being easy," he continued. "And I think this is simple. I think what I want to say is simple. I want to say that I have thought about you every day since about the 4th day I was on this ranch, and not in a way I can explain as practical. And I think that you are the most honest person I have ever met, and that your mind is the most interesting place I have ever had the opportunity to be near, and that when I come back from the mesa and you are in this yard, it is the best part of coming back." The garden was very quiet. A bird in the cottonwood at the corner of the yard made a brief comment and then thought better of it. Jane Covington looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was entirely beyond his ability to read, which frightened him slightly because he was generally good at reading things. Then she stepped over the bean row, walked to the edge of the garden, and said at a very close distance, "Aaron, I have been waiting for you to say something like that since June." He looked at her. "Since June?" "Since the night of the 4th of July, to be precise," she said, "when you held out your hand." "You could have said something yourself," he pointed out. "I could have," she agreed. "But you needed to get there on your own, and you did." She paused and the corner of her mouth lifted. "You are just very thorough about everything." "I am," he said. "I know," she said. "I find it one of your better qualities." He looked at her standing that close, with the afternoon light on her face and the honest warmth in her eyes, and something that had been held carefully still in his chest for months simply let go, and he reached out and took her hand, which was not gloved, and she curled her fingers around his and held on. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said. "If that is something you would have." "I would have it," she said, "properly and otherwise." He laughed at that. It was not a complicated laugh, just a real one, surprised out of him, and she smiled at him with the full force of the expression she had been keeping mostly contained, which turned out to be considerable. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly against his chest, the way a man does when the words he has are not quite equal to the feeling, and she let him hold it there for a moment before they both moved, not apart but together, standing side by side in the kitchen garden in the heat of early August with the big territory sky overhead, both of them slightly dazed and both of them, for the first time in their respective lives, not alone in the way that had always been simply the water they swam in. Reese Calhoun, who happened to be looking out the barn window, said nothing whatsoever and was very pleased with himself. The courtship of Aaron Maddox and Jane Covington was not a showy affair. It could not have been, given the natures of the two people involved, and it would have been false if it were. What it was honest and daily and deeply comfortable in the way of things that are right. He brought her things from the mesa. Not gifts exactly, but offerings. A piece of obsidian with a perfect edge that he had found near the canyon rim and thought she would like, because she had mentioned once that she had studied geology a little in her reading. A particular kind of dried wildflower that grew in one of the protected draws, and that he carried carefully in his hat for the better part of a day to get back to her intact. A bird feather that was iridescent in a way he thought she would find interesting, which she did. She made him things in return. She read to him in the evenings on the porch, which she had begun doing in late August. She had a fine reading voice, clear and unhurried, and she chose books that were interesting rather than improving, novels and histories, and one very dense scientific work about the geology of the Southwest that turned out to be genuinely fascinating once you got past the introduction. She fixed his leather vest, which had a seam coming apart at the shoulder that he had been ignoring. She learned, without making a ceremony of it, that he took his coffee without sugar and with milk when it was available, and she arranged for it to be ready when she knew he was coming in. They walked in the evenings when he was at the ranch, along the dry wash at the north end of the property, where the cottonwoods made a corridor of shade, and the air was slightly cooler than the open yard. They walked side by side and talked about everything, about the cattle and the grass and the condition of the water sources, but also about what they had read, about the territory and its politics and the pressures on the land from expanding settlement, about the Apache people who had lived in these canyon lands for generations, and whose displacement and confinement to the reservation in the years prior had changed the landscape and the character of the land in ways that Aaron, who had worked and lived through much of that period, found deeply troubling. "It is an injustice that will not undo itself," he said one evening, watching the last of the light leave the wash. The land was theirs. The agreement of it was changed without their agreement, and then changed again, and the men who changed it called it progress. Jane was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that the ease with which powerful men rename their harm is the most dangerous thing in the world," she said, "because if you can call taking a thing by a better name than taking, you can do it without feeling what it is." "He was right," Aaron said. "I know," she said. And they walked on, and the weight of that history lay around them in the canyon air, acknowledged and held and not resolved, because some things could not be resolved in an evening walk or in a story, only carried honestly and not forgotten. Margaret Covington gave her blessing to the courtship with the efficiency of a woman who had seen it coming and had no objections. She called Aaron into the kitchen one morning in early September and said, "Mr. Maddox, I assume your intentions toward my daughter are serious and honorable." "They are, Mrs. Covington," he said. "Good," she said, and handed him a cup of coffee. "Then we understand each other." Hector Dunleavy was more voluble about it, which was surprising, because Hector was generally a man of few words himself. He shook Aaron's hand one evening and said, with more emotion than Aaron had seen from him, "She is the best thing that has come to this ranch in 20 years, and you had better know what you have." "I know it," Aaron said. "See that you keep knowing it," Hector said, and that was that. Clara was simply radiant with satisfaction, in the manner of someone who had been proved right about something they had said early. September came in with cooler nights and the first hints of the turning season on the high mesas, and one evening, on one of their walks along the Cottonwood Wash, with the stars starting to appear in the deep blue above and the smell of cooling earth all around them, Aaron stopped walking and turned to face Jane. She stopped too, reading his stillness the way she read everything about him, which was with full and accurate attention. "I have been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You have been thinking since Tuesday." He looked at her. "You can tell. You get a particular quality of quiet when you are working something out," she said. "It is different from your regular quiet. It has more density." He thought that was one of the most accurate things anyone had ever said about him. "Then you know what I am about to say," he said. "I think so," she said, "but I would like to hear you say it." He held her hands in both of his, there in the Cottonwood Wash with the stars thickening overhead and the faint sound of the cattle on the distant mesa and the warm territory night settling around them. "I want to marry you, Jane," he said. "I want to build something with you. A home, a life, all of it. I know I am a man who will never be much for crowds or conversation, and I know I will spend a fair amount of time on the range and come back with less to say than most husbands do. And I know that is not what every woman wants. But I believe, that it might be what you want, or close enough to it, because you are the first person I have ever been with who did not seem to need me to be otherwise." She was looking at him with that unguarded expression she had worn for the first time on the 4th of July, the expression that meant she was feeling something fully without managing it. "That is the most you have ever said to me at one time," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted it to be enough." "Aaron," she said softly, "it is more than enough, it is everything." She moved her hands in his, turning them to hold him rather than be held. "I will marry you. Yes. Absolutely yes, without qualification or reservation." He looked at her for one long moment that had the quality of something settling permanently into place, and then he leaned forward and kissed her, his first kiss of her. And she kissed him back without hesitation, and without any of the social shyness that might have been expected from a proper courtship in a proper town, because Jane Covington did not do anything halfway once she had made up her mind, and she had clearly made up her mind. They were married on the 22nd of October, 1882, in the small church in Harlan Creek that had been built by the town the previous year and still smelled pleasantly of fresh pine. The ceremony was performed by the circuit minister, a kind man named Reverend Alcott who came through Harlan Creek 4 times a year, and attended by Hector Dunleavy, Margaret and Clara Covington, Reese Calhoun, and about a dozen people from town who had come because they liked Hector, or because they had heard about Aaron, or because a wedding in a small town in the territory in October was not a thing you passed up when life was as plain as it was. Jane wore a cream-colored dress that she and her mother had made from fabric brought from Santa Fe, and she wore her hair down for the first occasion anyone in Harlan Creek had seen it, which turned out to be dark and abundant and fell past her shoulders, and was, in Aaron's private estimation, one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He wore a new shirt, which was his greatest concession to ceremony, and he had trimmed his beard and done something with his hair and stood at the front of the church with Reese beside him, and watched Jane walk toward him on her mother's arm, and felt the kind of clarity you feel when something you did not know you were looking for turns out to have been the thing you needed all along. When the minister asked if he took Jane as his wife, he said, "I do," in a voice that was quiet as his voice always was, but carried all the way to the back of the small church without effort, because it meant everything. When he kissed her at the end of the ceremony, Clara made a noise of absolute joy, and the congregation laughed, and Jane laughed against his mouth. And he smiled too, which was the most public display of emotion Aaron Maddox had produced in his entire adult life, and everybody who was there told the story of it afterward. The reception was held in the saloon's back room, which was cleared of its usual furnishings, and given over to tables of food that Margaret and 3 women from town had been preparing for 2 days. There was dancing again, the same fiddle player from the 4th of July celebration. And this time, Aaron danced with Jane for 3 straight songs without being asked. And she danced with him for all of them. And they did not talk during the dancing but looked at each other the whole time in a way that made the fiddle player, a sentimental man named Bert, think it was probably the best wedding he had played. They took Hector's wagon back to the ranch that night, because the Eastern Range bunkhouse was not a fit place for 2 people to begin a married life, and Hector had already arranged for them to have the small stone house at the north end of the ranch property, a 2-room structure that had been built years ago as a line camp, and that Jane had been quietly improving since August, curtaining the windows, adding a proper stove door, and planting a small kitchen garden on the south side that would be ready to produce in the spring. It was their home. It was small and it was right and it was entirely theirs. In the first year of their marriage, Aaron Maddox learned things about Jane Covington Maddox that he had not known, despite the fact that he had paid close attention to her for the better part of a year before they married. He learned that she was braver in the dark than in bright daylight, meaning she would tackle frightening things more easily in the nighttime hours when the world was quiet around her and her own thoughts were clear. He learned that she had a stubborn streak that was not visible unless you were on the other side of it, at which point it was unmistakable. He learned that she cried at some things and not others, and the things that moved her to tears were consistently the things that involved tenderness between people, something Clara did or said, a story she read, a moment of unexpected decency in an ordinary interaction, and she did not apologize for crying at these things, which Aaron admired. He learned that she was a better ranching partner than he had any right to expect. She had a practical intelligence that extended to the business of cattle and land. She read the territorial agricultural bulletins and the quarterly reports from the cattle board, and brought him information about grass management and water conservation practices that were being documented elsewhere, and that he was then able to apply on the Eastern Range. She kept the books for their household with the same double-ledger system she used for Hector's operation, and by the spring of 1883, she had identified enough savings in the way supplies were being ordered to suggest a modification that saved Hector approximately $40 a year, which in 1883 in the New Mexico territory was not a trivial sum. Hector, whose cough had not improved over the winter, told Aaron privately one afternoon in April of 1883 that he was thinking about the future of the operation. "I do not have children," Hector said. "Margaret and the girls are the nearest thing to family I have had in years. And you," he paused for the cough, "I want to make arrangements." "You do not need to think about that yet," Aaron said, though he could see from the older man's color and the depth of the cough that this was probably not true. "I have already thought about it," Hector said. "The lawyer from Bernalillo is coming next week. I want you to know so you are not surprised by it later." Aaron told Jane that evening, and she received the news with the steady composure she brought to hard things, and then she went to see Hector the next morning and stayed with him for most of the day, not talking much but being present in the way that was sometimes more useful than talking. Hector Dunleavy passed in the late summer of 1883, on a warm August morning while sitting in his cane chair on the porch of the main house, as peacefully as a man could go. The doctor from Bernalillo confirmed what everyone had suspected since December. His lungs had given out, worn down by a lifetime of work in the dry territory air. He left the Dunleavy ranch to Aaron and Jane Maddox in its entirety, and a portion of the house to Margaret Covington for as long as she chose to live there, because he was, as the lawyer from Bernalillo said when he read the will, a man who had been careful and clear about what he valued. The grief in the household was real and was carried honestly. Margaret wept, and Clara wept, and Jane did not weep immediately but sat very quietly for a long time and then went out to the kitchen garden and worked in the earth for an hour, which was how she processed things that were too big for stillness. Aaron stood with the loss of Hector in the way he stood with most things, steadily, and without denying that it was a loss. He had not been on this ranch long enough to know Hector in the deep way you know people over decades, but he had respected the man with the particular respect that comes from recognizing in someone else a quality you understand in yourself, which in Hector's case was the quality of knowing what you were, and not being ashamed of it. They named the operation the Maddox Ranch in the county records, though among themselves they still called it the Dunleavy sometimes, in the casual way that names accrete history. In the spring of 1884, Jane told Aaron she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen of the stone house in the morning while he was having his coffee, and she said it directly, the way she said all important things without preamble. "Aaron, I believe we are going to have a child. In the autumn." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and the feeling that moved through him was so large and so unfamiliar that for a moment he did not know what to do with it. Then he stood up from the table and went to her and put both arms around her, carefully, as though she were a thing of great value, which she was. She leaned into him and put her face against his shoulder and breathed, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the morning kitchen with the light coming through the curtained window and the smell of coffee and sage and the sound of Cutter moving in the nearby corral. "How are you feeling?" he asked against her hair. "Very well," she said, "tired in the mornings, but otherwise very well." "Good," he said, "good." He held her a moment more. "I am going to need to expand the house," he said. She laughed into his shoulder, surprised and real, because even now in this moment he was being exactly who he was. "You are," she agreed. He began planning the expansion the next day, which was so characteristic of him that nobody on the ranch was remotely surprised. The summer of 1884 was busy in the way that only the summer before a first child can be busy, which is busy with the kind of purpose that makes ordinary work feel like preparation for something larger. Aaron worked the range with Reese and 2 new hands he had taken on in the spring. A young man named Eli Torres, who was originally from a family near Albuquerque and who turned out to be one of the best horsemen Aaron had seen, and an older man named Wendell Frame, who was quiet and methodical and reliable in the fashion of good tools. He also spent every evening he was at the ranch working on the stone addition he was building to the north side of the house, a new room that would serve initially as a nursery and eventually, once more rooms were added, as a bedroom for children. Jane, for her part, did not slow down in any way that was visible until July, at which point she allowed herself to be a little less productive than usual during the afternoon heat, which was her sole concession to the child growing in her. She continued the garden, the accounts, the lessons for Clara, who was now 14 and becoming a young woman of considerable capability, and the general management of the household, with the efficiency that had characterized her since the day Aaron met her. In the evenings she sat on the porch of the stone house and read, or they walked the cottonwood wash the way they always had, more slowly now as August deepened, with her hand in the crook of his arm and the stars beginning to pile up above the canyon rim. "What do you think about names?" she asked one evening in late August. He thought for a moment in the genuine way. "If it is a boy," he said, "I would like Thomas for your father." "If you want that." She stopped walking. She looked at him and her eyes were bright in the way they went sometimes when something touched the place in her that was usually steady. "I would want that," she said, her voice not quite even. "Aaron, I would want that very much." "Good," he said, "and if it is a girl you should choose." "I have been thinking about Margaret," she said, "for mother." "Then it is settled," he said. She took his arm again and they walked on through the night, the cottonwoods moving around them in the desert air, and the cattle settled somewhere on the dark mesa, and the small house behind them with its new stone addition waiting. Thomas Aaron Maddox arrived on the 15th of October, 1884, at the stone house on the Maddox Ranch, attended by a midwife from Harlan Creek named Mrs. Ortega, who had delivered half the children in that part of the territory over the preceding 20 years. He was a healthy boy, dark-haired and loud in the particular way of newborns who have opinions about the world, and he weighed enough that Mrs. Ortega pronounced him fine before she even counted his fingers. Aaron held his son for the first time that evening, after Jane had rested and nursed him and the household had quieted, and he sat in the chair beside the bed and held the boy with the careful confidence of a man who had handled fragile, important things before and knew the value of being steady. Thomas looked up at him with the unfocused gaze of the very new, and Aaron looked back with the focused gaze of a man who had found, in this moment, something he had not known was missing. Jane watched them from the bed, tired and warm and wholly herself. "He has your eyes," she said. "He has your forehead," he said, which was true, the same clear, direct brow. "God help him," she said and smiled. He looked at her across the room, and the feeling in his chest was the same feeling it always was with her, but amplified to a degree that had no previous reference point, vast and anchored and completely without reservation. "Thank you," he said, which was not adequate to what he meant but was what he had. She shook her head just slightly. "Thank you," she said back, and meant the same immeasurable thing. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not eventless, not without difficulty, but woven through with the kind of substance that makes difficulty worth carrying, because the life around it is worth keeping. Reese Calhoun married a woman from Bernalillo in 1885, a widow named Dolers who had 3 children from her first marriage, and who turned out to be exactly the right person for Reese, direct and warm, and a wonderful cook. They built a house at the south end of the ranch property and added to the small community that the Maddox ranch had become. Eli Torres became Aaron's most trusted hand, not merely because of his skill with horses, but because he shared Aaron's quality of attention and his dislike of wasted words. He and Aaron developed the kind of working partnership that functions almost without speech, which suited them both perfectly. Clara Covington grew into a young woman of formidable intelligence and warmth, and in 1886, at the age of 16, she began corresponding with the new schoolteacher in Harlan Creek, a man named Felix Drummond, who had come west from Ohio with a degree from Oberlin College, a trunk full of books, and a complete absence of the frontier experience that Clara had spent 6 years acquiring. She taught him about the land. He taught her advanced mathematics, which she had always wanted but lacked the textbooks for. Their correspondence became a courtship of the most particular and literary sort, and when Clara turned 18 in 1888, she married Felix in the same church in Harlan Creek where Aaron and Jane had married, and the whole Maddox household attended with the genuine warmth of a family celebrating itself. Margaret Covington remained at the main house, which she managed with the same steady competence she had always shown, and she aged well in the way of women who have found their place and settled into it, her dark hair going silver at the temples, her amber eyes, so like Jane's, still sharp and warm. She was a grandmother figure to Thomas and to the children who came after him, and she was one of those rare people who are indispensable not because they demand to be, but because they simply are. The second child was a girl, born in 1887, and they named her Margaret, as they had planned. She had Aaron's gray eyes and Jane's face, which was a particular combination that people commented on because it was striking the directness of the gray and the warmth of the face it inhabited. She was a quieter child than Thomas, who had turned out gregarious and curious in a way that surprised no one who looked at the 2 qualities of his parents, and realized that some children are built on the energy released when 2 contained people finally let something open. Margaret Maggie, as she quickly became, was her father's daughter in the particular way that quiet children sometimes belong especially to quiet parents. She followed Aaron around the ranch yard from the time she could walk, watching everything he did with the same deep attention, and he was gentle with her in a way that was simply the fullest expression of the man he was, patient and thorough, and never treating what she wanted to know as less important because she was small. A third child came in 1890, a boy they named Daniel, for no one in particular, just because it suited him when they said it aloud, which was sometimes the best reason for a name. He was the one who was going to give them the most interesting years of their life, being the child who fell off the most things, attempted the most inadvisable experiments, and required the most creative responses from both parents. He had Jane's stubbornness and Aaron's physical ease in the world, which turned out to be a combination that resulted in a boy who could fall off a fence and land on his feet and immediately climb back up. By 1891, the Maddox ranch had grown. Aaron had acquired an additional 600 acres of grassland to the east, negotiated patiently over 2 years with the land grant holders, and had expanded the herd and the operation in ways that were steady rather than aggressive, the way he did everything. He had a reputation throughout the territory now as a cattleman whose word was good and whose operation was sound, which was the reputation he had always wanted because it was the reputation he had always tried to earn. Jane ran the books and the household and the kitchen garden and the correspondence and the school lessons for the children, this last activity bringing her back to the thing her father had done that she had loved most, the actual teaching, the asking of questions that led people to their own answers. Thomas was a quick learner who liked history and geography and was already talking about the university in Santa Fe, which was ambitious and which Jane was already quietly saving toward. Maggie was methodical and precise in her learning, which meant she learned more slowly than Thomas but retained everything she learned, and Jane recognized in her the particular mind that would eventually find one deep thing and know it completely. Daniel tried to learn everything all at once and was maddening and wonderful in equal measure. One evening in the spring of 1891, Aaron came back from the eastern range at the end of a full week out, and he unsaddled Cutter. Cutter was 21 years old now, which was a full life for a horse, and he moved with the dignity of an elder, and he walked to the stone house, which had grown over 9 years of careful addition into something that was a real home. With 4 rooms and a proper porch and a kitchen garden that was 3 times the size of the original, and tended with the love of a woman who had always understood that what you grow is what you keep. Jane was on the porch with a book open in her lap and a cup of tea beside her and the evening light on her face, exactly as she might have been on any evening of their 9 years together. And she looked up when she heard him coming, and her face did what it always did when she saw him, opened, simply and without performance, in the way of a person receiving something they are glad of. He sat down on the porch beside her and took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, which was streaked with gray now at the temples, and she reached over and took his hand the same way she always did, and he held on. "Good week?" she asked. "Good week," he said. "Grass is coming in well on the east draw. Eli found another access route to the water tank that will save us 3 miles of driving in the summer rotation. Eli is worth his weight in silver," she said. "He is," Aaron agreed. They sat in the quiet together, which was the most natural thing in the world. Inside the house, Thomas was doing something with a map. He had acquired an obsession with the Geological Survey maps of the territory and was always spreading them on the kitchen table, and Maggie was reading. And Daniel had been told 30 minutes ago to go wash before supper, and was certainly not washing, but was instead probably attempting something architectural with the fence posts near the corral. "Daniel," Jane said, at a volume calibrated precisely to carry to the corral but no further. A brief pause. "Yes, ma'am," came the distant reply, followed by the sound of small boots on dry ground moving toward the water pump. Aaron's mouth curved. He looked at her. She was already looking at him. "You knew exactly where he was," he said. "I always know exactly where he is," she said. "It is survival." He laughed, quietly, and she laughed with him. And the evening settled around them in the mild spring air, with the smell of the garden coming up from the south side, and the canyon rim catching the last of the light in the way it did, turning the red rock to copper, and the stars beginning to suggest themselves in the deep blue above. He thought about the day he had ridden into Harlan Creek 9 years ago on a horse the color of dark earth, with his few belongings and his long habit of silence. A man who had spent his whole life being useful to other people's operations, and had not spent a great deal of time thinking about what he might build if given the chance and the right companion. He thought about the 4,000-acre range he now managed, and the children in the house behind him, and the woman beside him, and the life that had grown up around all of it the way the garden had grown, not forced, but tended and real. He thought about how she had never once in 9 years made him feel that the quiet was something that needed to be fixed. How she had never pushed him toward parties he did not want to attend or conversations he did not have the machinery for, never compared him unfavorably to louder men or broader performers. How she had simply known from early on what he was and had found it sufficient. More than sufficient. She had found it what she wanted. He thought that there were people in the world who spent their whole lives looking for the person who will love them as they are, and who never find that person, and he thought about what it meant to have found her on the 4th day of a job he had taken because a cattle broker in Santa Fe said a man could work alone on the eastern range without going mad. He had never spoken any of this to her exactly. He was not made for speeches, but she knew it. He was certain she knew it. The way she knew where Daniel was and what Clara needed, and what the soil near the fence would do in July. She knew the whole of him because she had paid the same deep attention to him that she paid to everything else, and she had seen clearly, and she had loved what she saw. "Jane," he said. "Yes," she said, without looking up from the horizon she was watching. "I want you to know that all of this is the only thing I ever wanted. I just did not know to want it until you." She was quiet for a moment, not in the processing way, but in the receiving way. "I know," she said. "Aaron, I know." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The sun finished going down behind the Sandia Mountains, and the sky went from copper to purple to the deep, irreplaceable dark of a territory night, thick with stars from one horizon to the other, the Milky Way a river of light overhead that spanned the canyon rim to the mesa and back again. Thomas appeared in the doorway and said that supper was probably ready if anyone was thinking about it. Maggie appeared beside him and said that she had set the table already. Daniel appeared from the direction of the corral with damp hands and a suspicious amount of mud on his boots, which he was hoping nobody would notice. Jane noticed. "Boots off before you come inside," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said, without missing a beat, dropping to the porch step and beginning to unlace. Aaron stood and offered her his hand, and she took it and stood, tucking her book under her arm, and they went inside together into the light and warmth of the house they had built, to the table their daughter had set, and the supper their son had thought to announce, and the third child removing incriminating footwear on the porch step, and the sound of Margaret's voice coming from the direction of the main house as she called to someone in the yard, and the whole living fabric of the life they had made, steady and full and good. That night after the children were settled, Thomas with his map, Maggie with her book, Daniel in his bed finally, blessedly still, Aaron banked the stove for the night while Jane braided her hair at the small mirror near the window, the same mirror that had been one of the first things she had hung in the stone house 9 years ago. He watched her in the mirror's reflection while he put away the poker, the ordinary intimacy of it, the ease. She met his eyes in the mirror. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking," he said, "that I am the luckiest man in the territory." She turned from the mirror to look at him directly, which was what she always did with things that deserved her full attention, and her expression was the open, unguarded one, the one that had first appeared on the 4th of July 1882 and had belonged to him, specifically to him, ever since. "I think," she said, "that we are both very lucky, and that we earned it by being exactly who we are." "You more than me," he said. "Do not do that," she said. "Do not discount yourself. You are a good man, Aaron Maddox. You are a good husband and a good father and a good neighbor and a good rancher. And you are the only person in my whole life besides my father who has made me feel that being exactly who I am is not a thing that requires apology." He crossed the room to her, and she stood to meet him, and he held her the way he always held her, carefully, because care had always been his instinct with things of value, and she held him back with the particular completeness of a woman who knows herself and knows what she loves. "The same is true of you," he said, against her hair. "That is the whole of it. You were the first person who did not need me to be otherwise. And that is the most important thing one person can be to another." She did not answer in words. She did not need to. She simply held on in the quiet of the stone house, with the stars outside the window doing what they always did, enormous and patient over the canyon country, and the children sleeping, and the cattle on the mesa, and the kitchen garden dark and growing on the south side, and the life they had built together settled around them like something permanent, like something real. In the years that followed, and there were many years, the territory becoming a state in 1912, and the Maddox ranch enduring and growing and eventually passing to Thomas, and then in part to Maggie, who turned out to have the deepest understanding of the land of all three children, and Daniel, who eventually went south to manage a horse operation near Las Cruces with the energy and inventiveness that had always characterized him. Aaron Maddox remained the quietest man in the county. People still said it about him when they spoke of him, which they often did because there was always something to say about a man who had built that kind of operation out of that kind of beginning. They said he was the quietest man they knew. They said that if Aaron Maddox spoke, you listened, because it was worth your while. They said that he was the sort of man whose silence had weight to it, not the weight of absence but of presence, the weight of something very full held very still. And Jane, when she heard these things said, which she sometimes did, at the social occasions in Harlan Creek that had grown with the town, or later at the county seat in Bernalillo, at the cattle markets and the church fairs and the community gatherings of a territory becoming a state, would listen to these descriptions of her husband with the small private smile of a woman who knew the full truth and did not need to correct the partial version, because the partial version was not wrong, it was just incomplete. They had 31 years together before Aaron's heart gave out quietly in the spring of 1913, as he had lived without drama, without warning, simply and completely. He was 59 years old. He was sitting on the porch of the stone house, expanded now, a real house, 6 rooms and a full porch around 2 sides, in the morning with his coffee, watching the light come up over the canyon rim in the particular way it did in April in the territory, the red rock turning gold and the sky going from gray to blue in the space of 20 minutes. Jane found him there when she came out with her own cup of coffee. He looked as though he had simply gone still in a different way than usual, which at first she had read as the morning quiet they had always shared, until she understood. She sat down beside him in her chair and held his hand for a while, in the morning light, and said what she needed to say in the quiet that had always been their native language, because 31 years had taught her that the most important things did not always require sound to be fully heard. Thomas came home within the day, and Maggie came from her section of the ranch, and Daniel came up from Las Cruces with a telegram and then himself on the next train, and the family gathered around the absence the way families do, and the grief was real and deep and honest, which was the way Aaron would have wanted it, not performed, not managed, just true. Jane Covington Maddox lived for 11 more years, into 1924, managing the house and the accounts and the kitchen garden still, always. The kitchen garden, with the same relentless, useful competence she had always brought to everything. She had grandchildren by then, 6 of them between Thomas and Maggie and Daniel's respective families, and she was with every one of them what her father had been with her. The person who asked the right questions instead of giving the easy answers, the person whose patience and attention made them feel that what they were and what they were learning was important. Clara and Felix remained in Harlan Creek, which had grown into a proper town, by the time Jane passed, and Clara came to see her sister every week until the end, bringing her own particular brand of warm and decisive love, unchanged from the 12-year-old who had appeared at Aaron's elbow at the July 4th celebration, and told him he liked her sister. When Jane passed, in the summer of 1924, in the stone house she had lived in for 40 years, with Maggie holding one hand and Thomas the other, and Daniel in the doorway with his hat against his chest, she went the way Aaron had gone, quietly, completely, without drama. They buried her beside him on the east side of the ranch property, near the Cottonwood Wash, where they had walked together for 30 years. The stone said, simply, their names and their dates, because simplicity was what both of them had always been, and it was the truest tribute that could be given to two people who had spent their lives understanding that the most important things did not need to be elaborate to be real. The canyon country spread out in all directions, as it always had, vast and red and honest. The cottonwoods moved in the summer air. The cattle on the eastern mesa were the great-grandchildren of the cattle Aaron Maddox had managed in his first spring on the Dunleavy Range. The kitchen garden on the south side of the stone house was tended by Thomas's wife, who had learned from Jane, who had learned from paying attention, which was the oldest and most necessary inheritance. It was, in all its particulars, exactly what they had built together, simple and not easy and entirely worth it. The quietest cowboy in the territory and the woman who had loved him for exactly what he was, without reservation, without revision, and without a single moment's wish that he had been otherwise. They had been enough for each other. They had been everything.